Hello and welcome. We'll be starting at just at 1 minute after the hours to give folks enough time to get into the platform. Hello and welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Molly D'Agostino. I'm a policy director at UC Davis, and I'm here representing the UC Institute of Transportation Studies. We're delighted you joined us for today's webinar on California's public transit finance woes and prospects for ridership recovery. This webinar is organized by the UC Institute of Transportation Studies, or UC ITS for short. The UC ITS is a network of faculty, students, researchers, and administrative staff dedicated to advancing the state of the art in transportation, engineering, planning, and policy for the people of California. The UC ITS was established by the California legislature in 1947, and UC ITS branches are at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UC Irvine, and UCLA. You can stay connected to our campuses by joining our mailing lists. The new research you'll be hearing about today was made possible through funding to the UC ITS received from the state of California to support the Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative. So I'm going to go over some quick logistics before we begin the webinar. Folks are familiar with this, but just to clarify, we'll be meeting to get today. We'll hear relatively short presentations from our three presenters, followed by a guest respondent, and roughly 15 minutes of Q&A. And everyone's going to be muted for the webinar if you're a participant. But if you have a question, you can use the question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That's questions to the speakers. If you have a technical question, not for the researchers, but for me or some of my amazing colleagues at UC ITS, including Laura Podolsky and Bernie Edwards, who are helping to administer this webinar, you can also use the chat box to let us know if you're running into any technical issues, and we could do our best to help you. This webinar is being recorded. A link to the webinar recording, presentation slides, and the associated report and policy briefs will be sent to everyone in a follow-up email, and we welcome you to share these materials within your networks. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce all of our speakers and our guest respondent, and then we'll go ahead and start their presentations. So first we have Jacob Wasserman. He's a research and project manager at UCLA, where he manages. Sorry, I'm behind on our slides. Here we go. We're at Jacob Wasserman is a research project manager at UCLA, where he manages research into public transit and other mobility issues at UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. Prior to joining ITS UCLA, he has lots of public sector experience working with Los Angeles Department of Transportation on finance and capital planning, and the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, known as SFMTA or SFUNI, and also the city of New Haven. He's an alum of Yale and UCLA. Fariba Sadiq is an urban planning doctoral student and researcher for the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. Her research has included topics like public transit safety, accessibility metrics, commute distances, and land use planning and around housing. She was formerly a lecturer at the Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology. And in addition to UCLA, she's an alum from the University of Utah. And John Gauber is a research associate and project manager at the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. He's also a transportation professional and consultant to public transit agencies, where he does planning, research, and analysis. John has over a decade of experience working to improve the utility and efficiency of urban transport, and we're thrilled to have him here to convey some of the highlights of his recent research. And John is a Georgetown and UCLA alum. Rod Lee began his career at the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit District, also known as BART, in 2008. And Rod is currently the assistant general manager responsible for the Office of External Affairs. Rod is also a member of the Executive Committee for the California Transit Association and is a member of the Bay Area Council Transportation Committee. Rod is also a USF and UC Berkeley alum. So we're very much welcome him to our UC ITS stage and look forward to hearing about his experiences at BART while navigating his transit finance and recent ridership challenges. And I also want to recognize that the California Transit Association was a co-sponsor of this webinar. They have an upcoming conference coming up later in November. So check out that conference if you're interested in learning more about the California Transit Association efforts. So thank you. Without further ado, we'll turn it over to Jacob and Fariba for the first presentation.
Thanks, Molly. I think I need to be able to share. All right, welcome. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Jacob Wasserman. Molly gave you all the introduction, and me and my colleague Fariba will be presenting on the financial aspects of the pandemic on transit systems in California and across the country. So I'll lead it off with some context and then throw it over to Fariba for results of a survey that we've taken. So let's talk a little bit about transit during the pandemic. John's going to get into this much more in the second presentation, but this is just to show transit ridership collapsed initially to lows of between 50 and 90% losses compared to pre-pandemic averages for transit agencies across the US and in California. And the recovery has been slow and uneven since. And that has had an effect not just for riders and people who use transit regularly, but also for the agencies themselves and their budgets. So this started in early 2020, the pandemic had just hit, and you can see some of these headlines: existential peril, transit in crisis. There was threatened service cuts. There was even sort of serious talk about transit agencies going bankrupt or closing. And this was because there was huge forecasted losses. This was because of fare revenue losses, but also because local, regional, federal revenues from all sorts of taxes and subsidies for transit were forecast to be way down as well during the recession. And even after the first stimulus bill, which I'll talk about in a second, passed, agencies were still burning through money and still worried about their financial solvency into 2021. But a large factor in transit agencies surviving the pandemic, and in fact, in a financial sense, doing relatively well, was the three federal stimulus bills: the CARES Act, CRISA, and the American Rescue Plan. And you can see here their dates and their amounts. And this was a sea change for federal transit funding, which previously was largely focused on capital. This could be used for operating expenses. There was no local match requirement and very few restrictions. So it was incredibly flexible at the right time. We started by analyzing Southern California, and we found that operators in the region got 1.3 times their ordinary year's worth of operating expenses just from the three stimulus bills. And that's on top of all the other funding they received. So it plugged short-term tax losses and persistent and longer-term fare losses, and it helped avoid a financial death spiral. We did some interviews where staff talked about how they would have had to make severe labor cuts and service cuts without the stimulus bills. But there are some nuances and differences between agencies and how they received stimulus funding. And in particular, it was left up to regions and metropolitan planning organizations how to divide stimulus funds between operators. They could use the previous formula that was used for capital funding before the pandemic. They could do it proportionate to agencies' operating expenses before the pandemic, or they could do it proportionate to their actual losses or their predicted losses in fares or other revenues. And depending on which one they chose, and we found that they often chose different ones for the first stimulus versus the second or third, that could result in different amounts of money in relative terms going to different types of operators. So again, we started with Southern California. In yellow are this set of very small municipal transit operators in Los Angeles County, and blue are the other much larger operators. And you can see as a share of their operating expenses, these smaller operators got much less because of the formulas that were chosen to distribute the stimulus funds. That said, we interviewed some of them. They still did pretty well. It was still enough to plug the holes, but they didn't receive as much in relative terms as the larger operators. And in addition to the stimulus funds, there were other sources of revenue that proved more resilient than was first forecasted. These are local option sales tax revenues, or LOSTs. They're a sort of extra sales tax passed in a number of California counties to support transit and other transportation projects. And the blue line is their receipts over time. They dipped initially, but even as cases went up with subsequent waves of COVID, people were buying stuff online. They were continuing to shop as the economy rebounded and the stimulus bills were passed. And these revenues actually rebounded to a higher average level into 21 and 22 than they were before the pandemic, which also helped transit. So with that, I'll pass it to Fariba, who will talk about our survey findings.
Thanks, Jacob. Yeah, so getting into the survey findings, we actually conducted 2 rounds of survey, and we conducted surveys like sent it out to agencies throughout the nation and also in California. Jacob, can you go to the next slide? So what you can see on the screen is the agencies that responded to our national survey. So we conducted 2 surveys. One, the first wave was in summer, fall 2020, and the other was in winter 2021, 2022. And this is for the national survey. And for California survey, Jacob, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so what you see on the screen is the location of the agencies that responded to our California survey. And we got responses from 44 agencies in California. So we sent the survey out to all member agencies in California Transit Association and California Association for Coordinated Transportation. We asked a number of questions about how the pandemic affected agency finances and services, and what changes they made to fare revenues, and what lies ahead, thinking about the financial future for the agencies. Next slide. So what we learned from our survey about the subsidies that the agencies received is that most of the agencies told us that they received more federal subsidies during the pandemic compared to the year before, which is not the case for the state, regional, and local subsidies. So most of the agencies told us that the state, regional, and local subsidies either stayed the same or was somewhat less during the pandemic than the year before. And we found similar result for the national survey. As you can see on the screen here, this is for the national survey, and pretty similar to what we got to know about California. So we also asked the agencies whether they made any changes in fare during the pandemic, and what we learned is that agencies did a number of things. So during the initial phases of the pandemic, agencies suspended fare collection or did not enforce fare collection. But in our recent survey for 2021-2022, what we found is that most of the agencies have returned to their pre-pandemic fare policy, as you can see at the top bar for the graph. And this is for California survey. And what we found for national survey is also very much consistent with what we learned for California. Then we asked the agencies about the financial effects on service and capital projects. And what we learned for that is, Jacob, go to the next slide. Yeah, like most of the agencies say that they had to do service cuts, and many had to do it substantially. So the most common responses we found for service cuts that they did is the adjustments that they made were moving to Saturday, Sunday services, or change the weekday and weekend service hours, eliminating some routes, and changing geographic coverage, changing headways and frequency of services. So agencies cut service mainly because of falling demand, labor shortages, and also anticipated revenue losses. However, they restored service in advance of returning ridership. About the surveys and the effects of budgets on surveys, what we learned was that from our first wave of survey is that at the initial phase of the pandemic, budgetary shortfalls were affecting service to a great extent, as you can see from the blue bars. But in our recent survey for the 2021-2022, like most of the agencies say that the budgetary shortfalls were no longer affecting service. And this is for California, and we found the similar trend for our national survey as well. We also asked about the effects of the pandemic on capital planning. And what we learned is that from our first wave of survey, that during the initial phase of the pandemic, the pandemic affected capital planning. So many of the agencies had their capital projects delayed or canceled or even accelerated. But in our 2021-22 survey, we learned that capital funding remained relatively unaffected in California, and also in our national survey, we found similar findings. So the next thing we asked is about the current challenges the transit agencies are facing, and like what financial future looks like. So we asked them whether they anticipate any financial shortfall once the stimulus funding is spent. So in California, most of the agencies told that they anticipate some financial shortfall. So as you can see from the top two bars in this graph. However, for national survey, we see a contrasting finding. So it was a divide between the agencies, so about 40% agencies say that probably no financial shortfall will occur. And about 50% of the agencies say that some financial shortfall will occur once the stimulus funds are spent. Then the agencies also mentioned, like, it's not based on our survey, but based on our analysis and from our other work, we learned that telecommuting might have an effect on the slower recovery ridership. So this is from US based work, so like survey of US workers looking at the rise of telecommuting during the pandemic. So as you can see that before the pandemic, about 6% of the of fully paid days were from remote work, which spiked in May 2020, about 60% or more than 60% of fully paid days were done by remote work, which declined in 2022, but still remained 5 times higher than the pre-pandemic level. And this has an effect on transit ridership. Jacob, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, particularly on the commuter systems. So that serves downtowns or other job centers. As you can see in the figure, the commuter systems like Metrolink, Caltrain, or BART are having slow ridership recovery, and one potential cause could be telecommuting.
And then our last major challenge we found now is labor shortages. So we're doing some more research on this, so I can talk about that more in the Q&A. But we found that 91% in our national survey and 87% in our California survey reported difficulty filling open positions in frontline jobs like bus and train operators and mechanics. This is resulting in missed runs and service cuts. It's a hard job being a bus operator during the pandemic, and there's a lot of push factors to go into other industries with the labor market right now, and pull factors. And we're finding that real wages, when adjusted for inflation, were flat for the couple of years before the pandemic and have recently started declining. So agencies are taking a lot of responses. Some are raising wages even outside of collective bargaining. Some are offering signing bonuses. But we don't know what the situation is going to be like if the labor market potentially cools as the economic situation in the country changes. So just to leave you with a few takeaways. The good news is we rarely get to report this in a webinar in our line of work, but we had a policy and it worked. There's a lot that could be critiqued about the stimulus bills and their size and the way that the funds were distributed across agencies, but overall they helped transit agencies weather a major financial storm. The problems, though, are still on the horizon, and it's a little unclear which way transit ridership is going to go. It's still returning sluggishly. Federal support is ending, and the stimulus funds are being spent down, and there's workforce issues that agencies are facing right now. So I just want to thank the whole research team. We have a group of grad students and staff and faculty working on this project. And you can find all of the research in the links in the chat and on this slide. Thanks so much, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Thank you so much, Jacob and Fariba. So I'll invite John Gabar to present his findings. So go ahead and share your screen when you're ready. Okay, we can see them. Go ahead, John. But I can't see you.
Thank you, Molly. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending. I'm pleased to talk to you this afternoon about transit's evolving operations. I'll talk about transit ridership, one of the challenges Jacob mentioned, and what some strategies that research suggests would be effective at increasing ridership. So when transit people talk, we talk a lot about all the good things that transit can do and should do. But transit can't achieve any of these goals if ridership is not there. We can't reduce vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gases, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, that is, if buses and trains are running empty. So ridership matters a lot. It has to be the focus. And so let's talk about it. You saw in Jacob and Fariba's presentation how ridership plunged during the pandemic. And now, as Jacob and Fariba mentioned, it's recovering slowly, both in California and nationally from its April 2020 low point. We know that in the recovery, bus service and ridership are recovering faster than rail. We also know that the recovery is uneven across the state. The LA region ridership, in yellow here, orange, is closer to pre-pandemic levels than the Bay Area. But let's back up further to pre-pandemic times, if anyone can remember those. Transit had a bit of a renaissance in the early 2000s. Here we see that ridership in this line, dark line, dotted line, actually increased for a while up until about 2008. And public investment has steadily increased since then. But ridership, notice, has flattened out around 2008 and has remained pretty flat. And when you look at ridership per capita, it has been more or less flat since 1990, despite increases in service, as shown here on the gray line with per capita vehicle hours. This goes to show that, unfortunately, transit ridership has floundered for a while. It isn't just due to the pandemic. So what's going on here? Well, lots of things affect transit ridership, and lots of things that do affect ridership are things that transit managers can't do anything about. For an individual rider, for example, things like current gas prices, the weather, the purpose of their trip, and the difficulty and distance of getting to transit will affect whether many will take a trip on transit or not. And those things are things that transit managers can't do anything about. At a macro level, transit ridership is depressed by economic factors like GDP growth, rising incomes, and increased car prices. Increased car access. And that last one, car access, is a big one, a really big factor. The good news is there are important things that agencies can control, like how reliable their service is, where the service operates, when it operates, and to what destinations, how well it meets specific rider needs, what fares are charged, when fares are charged, and how fares are charged. Also, what connections are available at stations. Bike share in particular is found to positively increase rail ridership. And all of these things are within agencies' control. So we'll talk about these things more in a minute, but first let's talk about what riders want. What do they want? Well, riders want basic things first. Most importantly, riders want to feel safe, and they want to feel safe on and on their way to their transit trips. Then they want their buses and trains to arrive on time and not leave them waiting long. They want transit to be easy to access and for information to be available and accurate. And other things like amenities are much less important, and even less important when they don't have to wait long at the station. So these things are so basic, so very, very basic, that they might be overlooked. And past UCLA ITS research shows that there's actually appears to be not much overlap in what's front of mind for the traveling public and the professionals providing service. The things that public stakeholders were thinking about, service, weren't really aligned with what professionals were thinking about. And when we look at what's important to riders and how satisfied riders are with those important things, what sticks out is that they think safety and security is really important, and riders are not satisfied with the safety and security they get. This is a high important topic and a low satisfaction topic here. Now, similarly, connections and reliability are also important, and satisfaction is fairly low here as well. Notice amenities are not that satisfactory, but also not that important. Research also shows consistently that riders don't like waiting. They really don't like waiting, and they don't like transfers. And transfers also often involve waiting, of course. And waiting is the basis for many security concerns, the rider's number one concern, of course. Here we see that zero transfers are actually so valuable that riders are willing to pay more. They're willing to pay more not to transfer than they are to get a faster trip. And I think sometimes transit planning doesn't always take this into account, that actually zero transfers are that valuable, more important than the speed of a trip even. So now that we've talked about what riders want and value, let's talk about strategies for improving ridership. Give people what they want. That's it. Easy, right? Safety, security, short waits, frequent service, reliable service, and easy access. These are the things that really, really matter to riders. That's all we have to do. Now, we talked about how safety is most important to riders. Here, I wanted to point out how improving service also improves safety. When you have frequent and reliable service, riders can have confidence that their transit bus or train will arrive on time, and so they don't need to wait long at the stop or station. That helps them feel safer. Good and accurate real-time information adds confidence and helps them avoid long waits when the bus or train is late as well. We talked about how riders really don't like waiting and transfers, but when service is consistently frequent and reliable, waiting and transfers are less burdensome. And obviously, the more frequent service is, the less waiting you have. And the easier it is to access a transfer, for example, by only needing to cross a platform with very little walking, the less transfers are a problem too. So frequency, reliability, and access are key to making transit attractive and useful. Transit needs these three legs of the stool to work. Take one of them away and you're missing something big, and you have dissatisfied riders. So delivering means making it easy for people to get to a transit stop and not wait long for their on-time ride. And here we see how delivering on frequency, reliability, and access gives people what they want from transit: reliable service, safe trips, short waits, frequent service, better stop access, and fewer zero transfers. We do all these things and we get satisfied riders. And we really want satisfied riders because they are the ones that ride more and get others to ride more too. So focus on these basics makes sense because of the virtuous cycle that you can start. When you improve service, you can increase ridership. With more ridership, you can provide more service. With more service, that gets you greater frequency, which is improved service, and so forth. Thinking about this cycle, the most important stage is reliability. When you start with reliability, you make the service you have better for the riders you have. And when your service is more reliable, you're more efficient. You can schedule more runs with the same resources. And that offers better service and attracts new riders. Once you have more new riders, you can add more direct service to improve access and increase ridership further. How specifically do we do this, though? I'm glad you asked. Various small steps can make a big difference. I'm going to focus on one tactic in particular called the tactical transit lane. As I'll discuss, the TTL, as we call it, can improve reliability, support greater frequency, and pave the way, so to speak, for further transit improvements. What are tactical transit lanes? They look like bus lanes, and they are, but they're special bus lanes. They're very short, typically, usually a mile or less, and sometimes even just a few blocks. They're targeted. They're put only in places where they're needed, and they're operational only when they're needed. They're very quick to install and very low cost, with a typical cost of about $100,000 to install a permanent one. And they're reversible. If things do not go well, they're easy to remove. So overall, a very low stakes strategy. The first bona fide tactical transit lane started in Everett, Massachusetts, with cones in the road. It was planned in weeks and installed in hours, if that. There was absolutely no public engagement on this project, and planners might be astonished at that there was no, might be astonished that there was no public engagement. But as the City of Everett planner, Jay Monty, explained, the pilot was the process. It was through the pilot that they heard what the problems were and what concerns were. That was their method, and it proved to be very effective. The project turned out to be very popular, and it is now permanent. It is also copied around the country now. A lot of similar projects in the Northeast, but not exclusively there. There are different types of approach on this. Some are like Everett, the quick pilot or cone pilot. Pilots lasting as short as 3 days. Others are slightly more traditional with longer planned lifespans and traditional outreach. But often when these cone pilots grow up to become permanent lanes, and they're often red painted. So here on the right side, this is actually Everett's lane. So that it went from cones to this. We go from cones to zones, and most do become permanent. One of the interesting things about pilot projects like this is that they show clearly what concerns are real and which ones are just fears. Planners in this study reported lots of community concerns about parking and traffic, those familiar concerns, before the TTL pilots were installed, but they heard very few concerns or fewer concerns after. So lots of concerns about parking before, but once the project was installed, they didn't hear very many. The same with traffic, loading zone. They're really more fears than concerns once it was installed. Now, the reason TTLs are an important tool for transit operators is that they significantly improve reliability. They don't improve speed much because they're short, usually installed only in pinch points. But speed, remember, is not a top concern to riders. They care a lot more about reliability. And TTLs significantly improve reliability. I want to point out in this example from the town of Arlington, Massachusetts, which copied the cone project concept, the difference in variability on their routes before in the orange and after. Really, really significant change. In the city of Denver, in installing one of their TTLs, they found that in 6 months, their ridership increased 2.8%, fairly significant for such a small, low-cost project. And despite the fact that those travel speed improvements were actually very modest, of only 3 to 6%. I think this shows that reliability really, really matters. I'm focusing on TTLs, but I want to mention a complementary technology that you may already be familiar with, transit signal priority. And this is a technology that gives buses the ability to request longer green lights and or shorter red lights, so the bus doesn't have to wait at red lights as long. This improves travel time, reliability, and can help support better headways and frequency. It's usually installed along major corridors or busy intersections or at pinch points, and it can be used with TTLs. They're complementary. When you put it all together, you can tell riders all about it, as CTA has done. CTA in Chicago has trusted its riders to understand that these things add value to their transit trips, and they've called out things like the dedicated bus lanes and transit signal priority, things you think of as maybe a little bit technical and jargony for transit planners, but this is in their route pamphlet for riders as a service feature, because they're showing their riders that these things do add value. So to connect the dots, we know that riders want the basics, and the basics are basic. They're not splashy projects, what we're talking about. But what we see is that these small scale solutions exist for making large improvements to the things that matter most to riders, namely frequency, reliability, and access. So some takeaways here are that, and to summarize, are that ridership's recovering slowly. Transit's it's currently now operating in a pandemic or recovery context, and that is a new world for transit. But the strategies for increasing ridership remain the same. That context has not changed. A lot of things influence ridership, and not all of them are within agencies' control, but some are. And research shows that the things that matters most to riders, the reliability, the frequency, and accessible transit, those are the things that are within agencies' control. Also, many cities have had success conducting these tactical transit pilot projects and to experiment with low-cost ways of improving reliability, speed, and overall service quality. And they've been very, very effective and copied throughout the US. This is, I think, which goes to show that sometimes many of the best solutions are simple. Improving reliability also, and I think this might be the main point here, is that improving reliability can start a virtuous cycle of ridership and more service. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues in the research team who are involved in various aspects of this research: Jeremy Epstein, Jacob Wasserman, and Juan Matute. Also, this work was done in partnership with the UC Berkeley Institute of Transportation Studies. And I'd also like to acknowledge that this research was supported by the UC ITS Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative with funding from the state of California. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you for attention. I look forward to discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. And I'll invite Rod Lee from BART to provide some feedback on our presentations and also introduce some of the challenges that BART has been facing during these times. So thank you so much to our previous speakers, and thank you, Rod, for providing that information for our listeners.
Molly, thank you very much, and I appreciate the invitation from the UC Institute of Transportation Studies to join this discussion this afternoon. John, Fariba, and Jeremy, you and your colleagues did an excellent job with your research and presenting your findings. Even though your data and your analysis are very sobering, it's very accurate and quite useful for plotting a path forward. So thanks for all of your work. And good afternoon to everyone. I just want to take a couple of minutes to contextualize and substantiate some of the research from BART's perspective through a lens of regionalism in the Bay Area. BART is a regional rail system serving 5 Bay Area counties with the ability to move twice as many people across the Bay as the Bay Bridge. 1 in 5 BART riders connects to another transit agency within the Bay Area. That's almost 90% of interagency transfers connect to BART. This is important because there are more than 24 transit agencies within the Bay Area. So in order for BART to improve its overall passenger experience and regain ridership, regional coordination is an absolute must. And due to the leadership of the BART general manager, the transit general managers throughout the Bay Area have been coming together weekly since the outset of the pandemic to share best practices and work on things such as service planning, improving fare coordination, and improving mapping and wayfinding. So going back to the outset of the pandemic, BART ridership dropped to 6% of its pre-pandemic ridership, 6%. Currently, nearly 3 years later, we are only at 40%. And in our base case scenario, we do not expect our ridership to recover to 70% until fiscal year 27. So now you may be thinking, why is that the case? Well, as was highlighted earlier, increased telecommuting or remote work has caused a significant decline in ridership and consequently a significant decline in revenue. These declines are particularly acute for BART for a couple of reasons. First of all, pre-pandemic, BART had one of the highest fare box recoveries in the country at over 60%. Secondly, the Bay Area has the slowest return to office rate in the country. With those factors, our operating revenue has reduced dramatically. Thanks to the president and his administration, Speaker Pelosi and Congress, BART received $1.6 billion in federal stimulus funds, which helped us tremendously, and we are forever thankful and grateful. However, we have exhausted that funding in the base case scenario outlook by August of 2025. And other agencies in the Bay Area are in similar situations with their fiscal runways also shortening very quickly. So what are we doing about it? First, seeing it as an opportunity to focus more on the customer experience to grow ridership. As John mentioned earlier, riders want the basics. The basics. Safe, frequent, reliable, and clean service. We heard it today, and we have heard it through our own polling. We've also heard it through the polling of others. So as a region, we are doubling down in those areas. Also, we realize a new funding model is imperative for transit agencies that heavily rely on fare revenues to operate their systems. So in coordination with our MPO, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and also with the leadership of the California Transit Association, those discussions have begun. And in this upcoming legislative session, we collectively will have those discussions with our legislators. In the Bay Area, a regional transportation measure will be needed in the future. But until then, we need the state to seriously consider funding transit operations, at least until a regional measure can be passed on a local level. So I will end by once again thanking the Institute of Transportation Studies for inviting me to participate, and I will make a call to action to all the participants in this webinar this afternoon to be a proponent of sustaining such a vital public good such as public transit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rod. Really appreciate those remarks. I'll invite our panel to come back on video and join me for our remaining time for a Q&A. I will be speaking on behalf of the people who anonymously posted questions in the chat. Actually, I'll recognize that one of the chat's anonymous questions, because it really mirrored some of the questions I had in my back pocket. So I'll turn to that question to our full group about what's your take on the future of transit ridership in the context of longer term trends in residential location? And do you think that service will follow as things kind of come back in downtowns? And I guess if you had a crystal ball, when would you think that would happen? So Brad, you suggested that 2027 was an outlook that you had. Do any other panelists want to pretend that they have a crystal ball and provide some feedback on that question? I know it's a toughie.
So I will jump in here because BART, in conjunction with Capital Corridor, as well as the California Transportation Agency, known as CALSTA, have been working on a program called Link 21. And what that is it's linking the 21 Northern California region counties together on regional rail. And that's to obviously connect the outlying areas to the core of Northern California and the Bay Area, specifically the economic and the employment centers. And that's a program that's underway right now, which recognizes the sprawl beyond just the suburban area out into the outer regions of Northern California to provide an opportunity for all to use public transit to access these sectors and centers of employment and education.
I think it's a Mark Twain quote or a Groucho Marx quote that a prediction is a dangerous thing, especially when it's about the future. But I'll try. I think that we collected some data in Southern California from MetroLink, which is the rail agency, which I think was on a roughly similar timeline to what you were saying, Rod. A small bus operator in Ventura County hadn't projected out that far, but I think by fiscal year 25 was not seeing ridership fully returned. But these projections are hard. We have a lot of evidence from past ridership modeling that oftentimes the models that planners use don't end up accurately reflecting what new ridership patterns look like, or the use of a new capital project, for instance. So it's hard to say. I think that the changes in residential location are going to be something that we are on the lookout for, that I'm not sure we have the data to answer yet. But it might call for new modes of transit that beyond the fixed route bus. I think the financial details of microtransit have still yet to be worked out, but it's something that might be on the horizon if residential patterns do indeed change significantly.
Great. Yeah, thank you for those insights. I think I want to turn to a comment that Rod made about the state role. Because this UC ITS research is funded by the state, we're really interested in that state policy role. And I know there is an upcoming discussion, an ongoing discussion about how the state can reform transit funding so that we can, ensure that this positive cycle, this upward cycle that John mentioned can occur. So how can you expand on what that state role could be? Is it just more money, or is it a way of allocating money in a way that can be more strategic?
Molly, is that question for me? I'm sorry.
Why don't you get us started? Thank you.
All right. I think the answer to your question is both. I mean, obviously, there needs to be some identification of where that money comes from. And that discussion, as I mentioned before, is in the very early stages. I know agencies here within the Bay Area are working with our MPO in regards to putting together our fiscal analysis in regards to when the funding that we receive from the federal government actually does run out, and there is a gap in funding for operations. And we're working with, as I mentioned, CTA, so that we get our Southern California and Central California partners involved in that discussion. So collectively, we can go to the legislature and make an ask, at least for what we're calling some gap funding, until we can pursue something on a regional level. And there's a question that was in the chat in regards to that as well. And it's just depending, the timing on that is really depending upon kind of the appetite of the public. And right now, as we all know, there's a lot of focus in the Bay Area specifically, and in California in general, on housing, affordable housing, the homelessness crisis, as well as public safety. So the polling that we have seen thus far have those above public transportation. So the focus most likely will be on pursuing those and trying to resolve those issues. And then shortly thereafter, be ready to go to the ballot, to the voters, and ask them to support public transit.
So I'm hearing that there's a need for both state and regional funding. It's interesting. Anyone else like to weigh in on this before we move on to another audience question? Okay. So one of the questions was about amenities. So I'd love for folks to speak to this question of whether transit agencies should invest in capital or amenities or in operations, and how they can make those difficult decisions. I know some of their hands are tied in terms of funds that they cannot use, for different purposes, but please expand on that. And especially John, if you don't mind starting us off, speaking with how the tactical transit lanes, you know, you mentioned that this was a relatively low cost effort, but you know, where do the funds come from to fund that kind of effort?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and that's a good question. And you mentioned tactical transit lanes, and that's an interesting case of funding actually, because most of the projects, TTL projects, are actually funded by cities, not transit agencies. So there's tend to be city departments that are doing the improvements. You know, it's often in conjunction with transit agencies, but it's a city project, not transit agency one. So speaks to the importance of good partnerships there, I guess. On the question of amenities, you know, I think it's certainly a good point. That's what we consider maybe a luxury. It might be truly essential to others. However, I'd say that overall the idea is that for things like, you know, shelter, that's very important in many transit contexts, but arguably becomes less important when you have reliably short waits, when you know that you're not going to have to wait at that stop. If you really can have that confidence, then that shelter is not going to be as important. So that's what we mean by amenities. The specific research that was done on that question also asked about things like the availability of food nearby, restrooms, things like that, that, you know, were considered, or in the results of the survey, less important. But certainly a point well taken that that it's going to matter more to some than others. Thanks.
Great. Anyone else like to weigh in on this question? A little pregnant pause there. Okay, we'll move on. So I think there's a question about, there's a couple of different questions about investments and how we've kind of addressed those already. So I'm gonna consider those addressed, but I'm trying to make sure we address all the questions in the chat. So I did see a question about ADA services. And so I do want to touch on that. This wasn't a topic that came up in the presentations, but I'm sure you all do have expertise in this area. So what can we say about the impact of transit ridership changes from the disabled community, and then also what service has been changed that may affect that community?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think ADA service, particularly during the pandemic, the importance of it to the transit network, it's often overlooked, but was redoubled and reemphasized. We interviewed some ADA service providers for this finance project, and what was interesting was it depends on kind of the setup. If in some regions they have a separate provider that other transit agencies contract their service to, and in other places it's done by the same transit agency that's operating the buses and trains. And when it was contracted out, there was less financial worry on the part of the paratransit provider, because they had a contract, and it's also a requirement of federal funds to put out paratransit. And so they weren't worried. They knew that they were going to get their funds from the transit agencies that contracted with them. It just passed the financial burden and worry on to their funders. So not necessarily a more secure situation, but it at least gave the paratransit providers themselves some security. Another issue that came up with paratransit during the pandemic was around free fares. So Fariba talked about our survey results where a lot of agencies went fareless for a time, but often that was structured as an honor system because there's a federal requirement that the paratransit service has to be a multiple, forgive me, I forget if it's 2 or 4 times, but it can't exceed the normal, the price of fixed route transit. And, you know, 2 times 0 is 0. So if it was formally free, they would have a serious funding crisis for very expensive to provide paratransit rides. And so that's why it was made kind of an honor system. So technically there was a fare on the books the whole time, so they could continue to charge for paratransit. And that's an obstacle, I think, that if agencies want to consider going fareless in the future, there's, you know, a robust discussion to be had there. But the effect on paratransit is something that they need to think about.
Yeah, since Jacob mentioned, I'll just jump in and mention that a Fairless future and possibilities like that. I mean, I think, and going back to the previous question, I think that it's a whole new world where fares are concerned. We didn't go into this topic in our discussion because that could be a whole separate webinar on transit fares and funding, but. One thing to note is how the TDA, Transportation Development Act, is arguably overdue for reform in this new context. It's in many ways in research we're doing, we're finding it's no longer aligned with contemporary state goals, and so this is something that I think there's a lot of growing interest in this sort of reform on that side too.
Yes, thank you. And actually so there are a number of questions that I'm gonna put together two of the questions that I see here on policy investments. And this is going to be our last question. So the sort of long-term financial planning and policy investments. And I imagine that in some cases, this is the goal of this question is to understand where will transit expand? Given these ridership constraints and, some cold water being poured on ridership expectations. So what is the answer there? Is there a need for more capital expenditures and more investment in expanding transit? I think this is a toughie. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot.
I'll jump in there and offer that I think that, and short answer is no. I don't think that more capital spending is the answer, because we've seen since 1990 and 2000 that the significant increase in capital expenditure really has not generated more ridership. So to be blunt, it's not really working. There's other parts that are part of the puzzle that are not there, and I think we need to focus on those. Sort of more strategic implementations like TTLs, but other things like that. Route restructuring, rethinking the way service operates, how it's paid for, how fares work. All of these things, I think, are more going to be more productive for increasing ridership, not continued capital expenditures beyond what we're doing already.
Yeah, and also like to add to what John said, and like John's presentation on amenities. Like we at UCLA ITS did a research on what challenges college students face when they ride transit. So like a lot of focus on like safety and security issues, and gender travel behavior, and how the amenities can be improved for a safer travel in transit. So those things are important as well, I think, so for attracting riders.
Yes, well said. Thank you all for those remarks and for your willingness to answer our audience's questions. And I really appreciate you all of the audience joining us today. And thank you again for the California Transit Association for helping to spread the word about this webinar. And we're looking forward to partnering on future webinars. So without further ado, I will thank you all for joining us and remind you to keep a lookout for a follow-up email with links to today's webinar recording, presentation slides, links to the downloads for the associated reports and policy briefs that we put in the chat. So if you didn't get those in the chat, you'll get them in your email. And thank you all, a special thank you to you all in advance for taking a couple minutes to fill out our evaluation survey. We really appreciate your feedback, and we strive to bring you valuable content and information in a format that's useful to you. So thank you all for those who attended today, and please share the recording and the information we provide to your colleagues. So thank you all, and I will, at exactly 2:59, so giving you, I feel like we're very punctual. I will thank our panelists once again, and really appreciate you all taking the time. Thank you.